Levi Rourke stepped out of the county transition office at 18, with one canvas backpack, one thin envelope, and no reason to believe the day would offer mercy. The office behind him had the same smell as every room that had ever processed him. Paper, dust, old air. A clerk had shaken his hand. A caseworker had wished him luck. Then the door had closed, and the world had done what it always did. It had left him standing alone. Inside the envelope were his documents, a debit card with a balance too small to plan around, and one notarized transfer naming him owner of a dry farm outside Cinder Flats, New Mexico. The property had belonged to Lenora Rourke, an elderly aunt he barely remembered, except as a hard-handed woman with sun-cut cheeks and a voice that never wasted words. Around the county, people used a shorter description. They called it the farm that could not hold water. The call came before the hour was out. Silas Dune, a land buyer for High Mesa land and water, spoke in the smooth, measured tone of a man who made ugly offers sound practical. He said the well was nearly dead. The windbreak rows had failed. The topsoil had been lifting off that ground for years. He said Levi had been handed a burden, not an inheritance, and High Mesa was prepared to remove it for a fair price. For a boy who had just aged out with nowhere certain to sleep, the number was real money. Enough for first rent, enough for a truck if the engine was bad but honest, enough to walk away. Levi listened. He did not argue. He did not thank the man. He asked one question. "If it's worthless, why did you call so fast?" Silas paused. Just for a second, long enough to matter. Levi ended the call and looked west. He did not choose the farm because he believed in miracles. He chose it because people only hurry when they think someone else is about to learn something. If this kind of hard country story means something, subscribe, leave a like, and say where the wind is hitting you from tonight. Then Levi started walking toward the bus station for the first time. Levi Rourke did not wait long after the call. By late afternoon, he was sitting on a northbound interstate bus that smelled faintly of diesel, vinyl seats, and the quiet fatigue of people moving between places that did not belong to them anymore. The envelope with the deed stayed folded inside his jacket. Every so often, he took it out and looked at the name printed across the bottom. Rourke Farm, 46 acres, Cinder Flats District. The bus pushed west across the New Mexico plateau, mile after mile of country that did not bother pretending to be gentle. Grass lay flat and colorless under the wind. The soil showed through in long red scars where the ground had split open under years of heat. Old irrigation ditches acequias cut generations ago ran beside the road like shallow graves, their bottoms cracked into gray plates of dried mud. A few windmills stood out there, not turning, just iron skeletons against a pale sky. The bus dropped Levi beside a faded sign where a gravel road met the highway. The driver nodded once before, pulling away, leaving the boy alone with the wind and the low hum of the empty road stretching both directions. The last 12 miles came from a man hauling livestock feed and fencing wire into Cinder Flats. The driver talked little. Most people out here did. The truck rattled across long ribbons of dust while the plateau opened wider and wider, as if the land had decided it had no reason to hide anything from the sun. Cinder Flats appeared slowly, a gas pump with a crooked canopy, a diner with 3 trucks parked outside, a low building with a wooden sign that read Bell Feed and Hardware. Levi stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Mara Bell, the owner and operator of the town's only feed and hardware store, a woman who had spent most of her life measuring people the same way farmers measured weather, carefully and without rushing to conclusions. Levi set the folded deed on the counter. "I'm looking for the Rourke place." Mara read the paper once. Then she looked at Levi. She didn't laugh. But the pause lasted a little longer than comfort required. "Rourke Farm?" she said. Her voice carried the calm weight of someone who had seen too many seasons to decorate the truth. "Folks around here call that place a labor sink." She slid the paper back across the counter. "That ground eats work," she said, "and gives back dust." Outside, the wind pushed along the empty street. Levi thanked her, stepped back into the light, and followed the dirt road that ran toward the edge of the mesa. The sky stretched enormous overhead, no tall trees, no sound of water, just wind moving through dry grass like something that once knew how to live and now only remembered how to whisper. The dirt road narrowed as Levi Rourke followed it west. Dust rose behind every step, drifting across the empty land like smoke that had forgotten its fire. The wind kept moving, steady and patient, the way it had likely moved across this mesa for hundreds of years. By the time Levi reached the property line, the sun had begun to fall toward the edge of the plateau. The first thing he saw was the fence. One corner post leaned so far it looked ready to lie down and give up entirely. The wire hung loose between the posts, sagging toward the ground. Levi stepped over it without ceremony. That was enough to understand the reputation. The farmhouse stood low against the wind, its tin roof peeled back in long silver scars where storms had lifted entire sheets away. One side of the barn had sunk several inches into the ground, as if the earth beneath it had quietly decided it no longer wished to hold the weight. 4 rows of old windbreak trees stretched along the northern edge of the fields. More than half of them were dead. The ones still standing were thin and cracked, their bark split open like dry hands. Their branches rattled faintly whenever the wind touched them. The old crop field lay beyond. Gray-white stains of salt spotted the surface. Wind had stripped the soil in patches until pale gravel showed through. Near the well stood a rusted wind tower, its pump handle frozen in place, as if the machine had simply forgotten how to move. South of the house was a shallow basin filled with broken rock and collapsed dirt, the remains of what had once been a rain catchment. Levi walked down into the old field. He scuffed the surface with the heel of his boot. The top layer lifted easily as dust, but beneath it was not loose soil. It was a hard crust, baked by years of sun and salt. He crouched and picked up a handful. Instead of crumbling soft in his palm, it broke apart like crushed brick. No explanation was needed. This was exactly the kind of ground people meant when they said land could swallow a man's labor. But then Levi noticed something. At the far western edge of the field, beneath the short shadow of a dying windbreak row, the ground carried narrow ridges. They ran side by side across the slope, straight, even. Wind and time could destroy almost anything, but they rarely drew lines that precise. Levi Rourke left the field as the light began to fade and walked toward the farmhouse. Up close, the building looked smaller than it had from the road. Years of wind had sanded the paint down to gray wood. The front door opened with a slow scrape that sounded louder than it should in the empty evening. Inside, nothing looked dramatic, just unfinished time. A glass sat upside down in the kitchen cabinet. A cast-iron stove rested cold and quiet against the wall. A calendar hung beside the doorway, stopped on a year-long past. On the windowsill lay a pair of gardening gloves, stiff with age. The fingers curled as if they still remembered the shape of work. The house did not look abandoned in a hurry. It looked paused. Levi stood in the kitchen for a long moment. He did not see love in that room. He saw a decision. For years he had carried a simple explanation. Lenora Rourke had chosen the farm instead of him. The system had taken him away, and the land had stayed. Standing there, the thought returned easily. If she had fought to keep this place alive for so many seasons, why hadn't she fought just as hard for a boy? Night settled quickly across the mesa. Heat drained from the air, and the cold followed close behind. Levi stepped outside and sat on the wooden porch steps. A flashlight rested beside him. His phone lay in his hand. Silas Dune's number still waited on the screen. Selling would make sense. No one would blame him. An 18-year-old with no money, no trade, no family left, and no water rights had no obligation to save a broken farm. His thumb hovered over the call button. Then the wind shifted. From somewhere behind the collapsed barn came a sound that did not belong to loose tin or dry branches. A hollow knock, low, dull, like air moving through a sealed space. Levi lifted his head. The dark sky offered no explanation. But in that moment, he knew something for certain. Tomorrow morning, he would not be leaving. Morning came pale and cold across the mesa. Levi Rourke woke on the farmhouse floor just after sunrise. The strange sound from the night before, still sitting somewhere in the back of his mind. Out here, wind made many noises. Loose metal, dry wood, empty structures shifting under pressure. But that sound had been different. It had been hollow. Levi stepped outside and walked toward the collapsed barn, where the wind had carried the noise. The air was still for the moment. Dust rested quietly across the yard. Behind the barn sat an old grain trough built from weathered cottonwood boards. The wood had split along the edges, and the whole thing looked like something that had outlived its purpose years ago. Levi pushed it aside to clear space to look at the ground. The trough moved farther than it should have. He stopped. Troughs left in the weather usually sank into the dirt with time. This one slid across the ground almost too easily. Levi crouched and pushed again. The entire box shifted sideways. Underneath, it lay a set of flat planks fitted together inside a wooden frame. Stones had been wedged carefully along the edges to keep the frame tight against the ground. Levi pried one board loose. Beneath it was not a root cellar or a storage pit. It was a work chamber. The space had been cut into the slope of the earth, half underground, half protected by the hillside. Dirt packed against three sides of the roof kept the interior cool. A short ladder made from cedar poles led down into the dim space below. Levi climbed down slowly. The air changed immediately. Cooler. Still. His flashlight passed across shelves, wooden bins, measuring stakes, sacks of seed tied shut with linen cord, and thin wooden boards marked with rows of pencil numbers. Nothing down there looked like the hiding place of someone who had given up. It looked like the workshop of someone who had spent years chasing a question and refused to let the answer die with them. Levi Rourke stood still for a moment inside the half-buried room, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. Then he began to look closer. The shelves were filled with cloth sacks, tied shut with linen cord. Each one carried a label written by hand in careful block letters. Broomcorn, red sorghum, dry rye, local millet. Some bags held seeds Levi recognized from feed stores. Others carried small symbols and marks beside the names, notations that did not appear on any commercial seed packaging. On the long work table lay several rolled field maps drawn in brown ink. Levi unrolled one carefully. The map showed the farm's fields divided into small sections. Lines marked the direction of the June winds. Small circles marked places where rainwater had once pooled after rare summer storms. Beside each section were notes describing how the ground cracked after 3 days of direct sun. Pinned beside the maps were thin, wooden slats. Each one carried a column of dates and numbers scratched in pencil. Well depth, year after year. The measurements dropped slowly over time. Nearby sat several glass jars filled with soil samples. Each jar was labeled with a depth measurement: 6 inches, 12 inches, 18. Levi turned one in the light and saw the difference in color between the layers. There were no computers, no polished equipment, no scientific instruments, only careful work, observation written down by hand, measurements repeated across seasons, small changes tracked over years. In one corner of the room stood a test rack built from rough cedar boards. Inside its frame were shallow boxes filled with different surface coverings: rotting oat straw, aged manure, cedar wood chips, Black River gravel, ash from a wood stove. Each tray held a small wooden tag. Each tag carried a note describing how long the soil beneath had stayed cool under direct sun. On the far wall hung a simple diagram. It showed shallow trenches cut across the slope of the field, following the natural contour lines of the land. Levi recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen those faint ridges out in the field the evening before. Lenora Rourke had not been waiting for the land to save itself. She had been studying it, trying to teach stubborn, drying ground how to lose water more slowly. Levi Rourke continued moving through the small underground room, careful not to disturb the order of things more than necessary. Near the end of the work table, he noticed a small cedar box. The wood had darkened with age, and the lid had been closed so many times the hinges moved without a sound. Inside the box lay two things: a thick notebook with its pages curled from dry air, and a folded letter. Levi opened the letter first. The handwriting was steady, carved across the paper in firm strokes that wasted no ink. Lenora Rourke had never been a woman who used extra words, and the letter did not begin with apologies. It began with facts. She wrote that when Levi was still a child, the farm had already begun losing money faster than it could produce crops. The well was weakening. The windbreaks were dying. Medical bills had taken what little savings she had. Then, the county stepped in. A single elderly woman with failing land beneath her feet had little chance of fighting the system that decided where a child should live. She wrote plainly that she had tried, and that trying had not been enough. There were no excuses written in tears, only a line that admitted something harder. There were years when she hated the farm for keeping her tied to debts she could not outrun, but she had also seen something other people had missed. Beneath the dead surface soil, some sections of ground still held moisture deeper down if the land was treated correctly, if water could be slowed, if wind could be blocked, if the ground could be shaded long enough to keep the little it had. She wrote that the dry seasons were growing longer, and that someday, the kind of land people called worthless might be the only kind left that could still survive. Levi's jaw tightened as he read. Then the tone of the letter changed. Lenora wrote about a night when Levi had run a fever and slept outside wrapped in her old work coat because the house had been too hot to breathe in. She mentioned how he used to crack barley grains with his teeth when he was small. Details no stranger could invent. The letter ended without asking for forgiveness. It asked for one thing: don't sell what you haven't taken the time to understand. Levi folded the letter slowly and set it back inside the cedar box. For a long moment he stood in the cool underground room, looking at the maps, the soil jars, the wooden tags, the quiet record of years spent studying a stubborn piece of land. Then he did what Lenora's work had always been pointing toward. He tested it. Levi did not call High Mesa. He did not argue with anyone in town. He walked back out into the field with the notebook in his hand. The western edge of the farm still carried the faint lines he had noticed the evening before, those shallow ridges that cut across the slope too evenly to be accidental. Lenora's notes described them clearly: shallow contour trenches, cut just deep enough to break the hardened crust, packed underneath with dead grass, stove ash, and whatever organic scraps could be spared, not to trap water, to slow it. Levi chose a narrow strip of ground along that western edge. He used a shovel to reopen 3 short sections of trench where the ridges had nearly vanished under wind-blown dust. The digging was not deep work, just enough to break the sealed surface and expose the darker layer beneath. From the collapsed shed, he gathered dry grass and mixed it with a small bucket of ash from the farmhouse stove. He spread the mixture thinly along the trench bottoms and covered it again with loose soil. Then he drove a few rough posts into the ground to prop up the broken windbreak line nearby, using scrap wood left behind in the barn. When he finished, the field did not look transformed. It looked slightly disturbed. That was all. 2 days later, a thin gray cloud passed over the mesa and dropped a brief, scattered rain, the kind that barely dampened the road and disappeared before anyone bothered to talk about it. The next afternoon, Levi returned to the test strip. The open ground around it had already hardened again. The surface had cracked into pale lines under the sun. But when Levi knelt beside the trench and pushed his fingers through the loose soil covering, the earth underneath was still cool, only a little, only for a few inches, but it was the first difference the land had shown in years. Levi Rourke stayed beside the trench for a while, letting the cool soil settle between his fingers. It was not a miracle, just a delay, but out on land like this, a delay could mean the difference between life and dust. The next morning, Levi drove the old farm truck into Cinder Flats with several pages from Lenora's notebook folded in his pocket. The name he asked for in town was Gideon Vale, a retired county surveyor who had spent 40 years mapping property lines, water rights, and the slow changes of land no one else paid attention to. Gideon worked out of a small office behind the old courthouse. Maps hung across the walls in fading layers of ink and pencil. When Levi spread Lenora's notes across the desk, Gideon studied them without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he leaned back. "Your aunt filed paperwork once," he said. "Years ago." Levi waited. "She asked the county to approve a runoff diversion and rebuild the rain catchment south of that farm." Levi remembered the collapsed basin, filled with broken rock. "The request never moved," Gideon continued. "Too expensive for land everyone thought was already dead." He tapped one of the maps. "I told her to sell it. The admission came out flat and unpolished. Land like that isn't worth dying beside," he had said back then. Levi did not argue. He only asked one question. If the idea was wrong, why did the catchment fail? Gideon shook his head slowly. The idea wasn't wrong. The slope work was unfinished. Without the right spill grade and erosion support, that basin couldn't hold during heavy runoff. In other words, the system had never been proven useless. It had simply stopped halfway. Gideon looked at Levi with a tired expression. "You don't have the money or the labor to fix all that before the dry season hits." Levi said nothing. After a moment, Gideon stood, opened a tall filing cabinet, and removed an old roll of county survey maps. He handed them across the desk. "Take them," he said. "If you're going to do something foolish, at least do it with the right numbers." Levi Rourke spent the next several days working the western field and the collapsed catchment basin south of the farmhouse. Using Gideon Vale's maps and Lenora's notebook together, he marked out shallow contour lines across the slope. The work was slow. A shovel, a pick, and long hours under a hard sky were all he had. Each trench followed the natural curve of the land, cut just deep enough to interrupt the flow of sudden rain before it could run downhill and vanish. He had only begun restoring the outer edge of the catchment when a vehicle appeared on the dirt road. The truck was too clean for the country around it. Silas Doon stepped out wearing the same calm expression Levi remembered from the phone call. His boots carried almost no dust. His voice carried the same polite patience. "I hear you've started repairs," Silas said. Levi rested the shovel against the ground, but did not answer. Silas handed him a folded sheet of paper. The number written on it was higher than the first offer. "Your well won't survive August," Silas continued gently. "Not if the rains miss their window." He looked out across the cracked field. "Some land doesn't want saving." Levi said nothing. Silas tipped his hat and drove away, leaving the dust to settle behind him. That night the wind rose across the plateau. When Levi walked the field the next morning, 3 wooden marker stakes from the western test strip were gone. A coil of wire holding part of the windbreak upright had been cut loose. No clear footprints remained. Wind erased tracks quickly out here. Later that afternoon, Levi stopped at Bell Feed and Hardware for supplies. Maribel listened quietly while he described the missing stakes. "High Mesa bought 2 more abandoned farms south of here this week," she said. Outside the store, Levi ran into Orrin Pike, a neighboring grain farmer who had worked dryland fields for 30 years. Orrin leaned against his truck and shook his head slowly. "You're chasing ghosts, son," he said. "When drought clamps down, no old notebook ever made rain fall." Orrin did not sound cruel. That was the trouble. He sounded like a man repeating something he had learned the hard way. Levi Rourke stopped talking about the farm after that. He simply worked. Morning after morning, he carried Lenora's notebook and Gideon Vale's survey maps out into the fields and treated them the way a carpenter treats a blueprint, not as theory, as instruction. The first job was the collapsed catchment basin south of the house. Levi cleared the broken stones and began rebuilding the outer lip with flat rock and packed soil. He worked slowly, placing each stone so the rim would resist erosion when runoff came. Too steep, and the first storm would tear it open. Too flat, and the water would slide past. After the basin came the trenches. Using the contour lines from Gideon's maps, Levi reopened shallow channels across the western slope. The cuts were never deep, just enough to interrupt a rushing sheet of rainwater and force it to pause before sliding downhill. Slow water was useful water. Along the trench beds, he spread layers of dead grass mixed with stove ash and aged manure, following the ratios Lenora had written in the margins of her notes. The mixture looked simple, almost primitive, but when the sun hit bare soil, it baked moisture away in hours. Covered soil breathed longer. Next came the windbreak. Most of the original trees had died years ago, leaving the fields exposed to the steady sweep of mesa wind. Levi drove rows of wooden stakes into the ground and stretched salvaged wire mesh between them. It was not permanent, just a temporary barrier strong enough to weaken the wind's first strike. Finally, he planted test rows. 3 different grains: millet, sorghum, dry rye, each one in separate strips to see which could survive the coming heat. Orrin Pike passed the property twice that week on his way to his own fields. Both times he slowed his truck and watched Levi digging in the dust. "You're burning young muscle on dead land," Orrin called once. Levi kept working. At the hardware store, Maribel quietly slid a small box of old nails across the counter. "Cleaning out storage," she said. "Didn't want them rusting another year." One evening, Gideon Vale drove out and stood beside the catchment basin, while Levi measured trench depth using a wooden rod carved with inch marks. Gideon watched the slope for a while. Then he pointed to one edge of the basin. "If that lip leans too far, the first runoff will cut straight through it." Levi studied the line. He adjusted the stones. No one said they believed the work would save the farm, but after a while, they stopped calling it foolish. They began calling it something heavier: stubborn. Summer tightened slowly around the plateau. The drought did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived with absence. A storm that should have crossed the mesa in early July passed somewhere far to the north. Clouds formed one afternoon and vanished before sunset. The wind came hotter than it had the year before, carrying dust instead of rain. In town, the old Acequia ditch sank lower each week until the mud bottom began to show through the thin flow. 2 farms south of Cinder Flats never planted their late crop at all. Orrin Pike began cutting water from one of his outer fields so the inner rows might survive. The land was making its choices. Levi watched the well gauge at the Rourke farm drop day by day. The water table was falling faster than he liked, but not as fast as the numbers Lenora had written years earlier for untreated ground. Out in the western field, the test strips told a quieter story. The covered rows were not green miracles. The wind still burned them. The heat still pressed hard against every leaf, but they did not collapse the way the open soil did. Bare ground nearby cracked and whitened under the sun within days. Inside the shallow contour trenches, the soil stayed darker longer. Beneath the thin mulch layer, the ground still held a trace of coolness, even after several days without rain. Down at the partially rebuilt catchment basin, the lower layer of earth remained damp, deeper below the crust. One afternoon, Gideon Vale drove out and stood beside the basin for several minutes. He studied the soil, the slope, the trenches. He said nothing. Later that evening, Silas Dune called again. This time his voice carried less patience. "High Mesa can wait," he said. "Drought always finishes the negotiation." Levi did not argue. Instead, he adjusted his work. He stopped trying to save the entire farm. The well water went only to the test plots, only to the sections where the trenches, mulch, and windbreak gave the soil a real chance to survive. It was the hardest lesson Lenora's notebook had offered. Drought was never defeated by hope. It was endured by choosing what could still live and protecting it properly. Late in the dry season, the wind quieted one morning just enough for dust to settle across the fields. That was when Orrin Pike crossed the property line. He did not arrive with an apology. Men like Orrin rarely did. What he brought instead was something heavier: attention. Levi Rourke was already in the western test field when Orrin approached. The neighboring farmer walked slowly between the rows, boots pressing into soil that still carried a thin layer of straw and ash. Orrin glanced once toward his own land beyond the fence. Out there, the outer rows had already surrendered. Wind had scraped the soil thin, until small gravel stones showed through the surface. Here, the difference was not dramatic. The test rows were not lush. The sorghum Levi had planted stood low and narrow, their leaves stiff from weeks of heat. But they were standing. Small grain heads had begun forming along the stems, alive. A truck rolled up along the road behind them. Gideon Vale stepped out carrying a short-handled shovel. He said nothing at first. Instead, he walked to the bare ground beyond the test strip and pushed the shovel blade into the soil. The metal struck dry earth with a brittle sound. When Gideon lifted the blade, the dirt fell away in powder. Then he moved into Levi's trench-covered section. He drove the shovel down again. This time the soil below the mulch layer lifted in a heavier clump. The earth held together longer before breaking apart. Not wet, but still holding. A few minutes later, Maribel arrived from town carrying 2 water jugs. She leaned against the truck and watched the 3 men standing in the rows. No one spoke loudly. No one celebrated. It looked less like a conversation and more like a quiet hearing held in the open air. Finally, Oren rubbed the back of his neck and studied the rows again. He nodded once. "This holds soil," he said. He did not say Levi was right. He did not say he had been wrong. Out on the mesa, that sentence meant nearly the same thing. Word of the western field traveled farther than Levi Rourke expected. Out on the mesa, news moved slowly, but it did move. By the time the worst stretch of the drought began to ease, enough people had heard about the small test rows that Gideon Vale made a call to someone outside the county. A week later, a dusty university pickup rolled onto the Rourke farm. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Dr. Elias Venn, a dryland systems lecturer from the State Land Grant College. He did not arrive with excitement or speeches. He arrived with a notebook, a soil probe, and a habit of measuring first and talking later. For most of the afternoon, he worked quietly. He dug test pits. He checked soil structure at several depths. He compared grain heads from the surviving sorghum rows. He studied Lenora's notebooks, line by line. When he finally spoke, it was while brushing dry soil from his hands. "Your aunt didn't invent a miracle," Venn said. He pointed across the western slope. "She assembled a system." He explained it in plain terms. The trenches slowed runoff before storms could strip the soil. The mulch reduced surface evaporation. The windbreak weakened the constant abrasion of dry wind. The organic layer fed moisture deeper into the ground, and the crops chosen were varieties built to survive dry conditions instead of fighting them. None of the ideas were new on their own. What mattered was that Lenora Rourke had combined them precisely for this land. Later that week, Silas Dune returned. This time, the offer sounded different. High Mesa Land and Water wanted access to the method permission to test the system on several abandoned farms they had recently purchased. Silas spoke carefully. Levi listened. The ground between them had shifted. Months earlier, Levi had been an 18-year-old boy standing on a dying farm, holding an offer meant to remove a burden. Now he held something else. Proof. With Gideon's help reviewing the terms, Levi refused to sell the land outright. The farm and Lenora's notes would remain his. High Mesa could only conduct controlled trials under clear agreements. Silas accepted, because Drought had already done the one thing no negotiation could replace. It had proven the land was not worthless. When the worst of the drought finally loosened its grip on the plateau, the Rourke farm did not transform into something beautiful. That would have been dishonest. Most of the land was still rough. Large sections of the old field remained bare. The shallow well was still weak, and the broken windbreak rows would need years before young trees could replace what had died. But several things had changed in ways no one in the county could ignore. The western test strips still held their topsoil. Where bare fields nearby had lost layers of dust to the wind, the shallow contoured trenches and mulch layers on Levi Rourke's land had kept the surface anchored. The soil there remained darker and heavier beneath the thin covering of straw and ash. The grain rows were not tall, but they were standing. Millet heads hung low on narrow stems. The small sorghum plants carried just enough seed to harvest and save for the next season. Down by the catchment basin, the partially rebuilt rim had held through a rare late summer storm. The water had not vanished overnight the way it used to. It lingered 3 days before sinking slowly into the soil beneath. That alone was enough for people to notice. Across the fence line, Orrin Pike began cutting his own shallow contour trench along the slope of his outer field. He never mentioned Levi while he worked. In town, Maribel placed several small sacks of grain seed on a shelf near the counter at Bell Feed and Hardware. She labeled them with a piece of masking tape and a black marker. Rourke Dry Rose. The name stuck quickly. Late one evening, Gideon Vale stood at the edge of Levi's field, while the wind moved quietly through the short rows of surviving grain. "Your aunt probably knew a year like this would come," Gideon said. Levi did not answer. He was busy tying bundles of harvested seed heads together with twine. When the work was finished, he carried the bundles down into the cool, half-buried room behind the barn, the same place Lenora Rourke had once measured soil samples and written notes about wind and water. He hung the grain along the cedar racks to dry. Outside, the land still looked hard, but the field held, and Levi Rourke was no longer homeless in the old sense of the word. Not because the farm had suddenly become easy, but because he now belonged to a piece of land the county had once called worthless. The drought had passed judgment, and what remained standing was work worth continuing. If you were 18, homeless, and inherited a farm everyone called worthless, would you have sold it right away, or stayed long enough to test the land yourself? Let us know in the comments.